Well, hello. I wanted to spend some time talking with you about the history of organization development. By looking at where the field has gone, you'll actually have some sense of what some of the main core elements that make up organizational development are. This diagram that you'll find in your book is very helpful in the sense that it will give you some sense of what the various movements have been in the history of organizational development. And so we're going to walk through each of these different movements and just kind of highlight some of the main points. As you can see, they sort of begin on this timeline from about the 1950s up to the 2000s. And so we will go ahead and process through some of these. In many ways, you can trace the founding of organizational development back to something called laboratory training in T groups. This work was founded primarily by Kurt Lewin, who actually died very early in his career, but managed to do a tremendous number of things. In many ways, he's considered a founder in both social psychology as well as organizational psychology. We're going to focus primarily on his emphasis on organizational psychology. He's known for having founded the Research Center for Group Dynamics at MIT, also referred to as the National Training Laboratory. This idea of T groups really arose out of some of the earlier research that he actually did on leadership, in which he actually looked at the distinction between democratic, autocratic, and laissez-faire leaders. And in looking at democratic leadership, obviously you're focusing more on groups as leaders. So this led to some of his discoveries around the idea of T groups, which were small, unstructured groups that were used to sort of explore personal issues. One of the things that he did is he had sort of attendees of these groups really kind of facilitate themselves. Researchers were really there nothing more than as observers, and he allowed the individual members to provide each other with feedback. You can actually see T groups in action in a number of fields. One of the other areas of research that I tend to dabble in is in the area of program evaluation, and so you'll actually see T groups used a lot as an evaluative source, oftentimes driven by the organizations themselves. One project that I was involved with some time ago actually had teachers who would meet together and discuss various issues that they were having in the classroom, and they would get feedback from other teachers. This is actually a modern day example of the concept of T groups. And so you can see very early on in the field of organizational development, the usage of the group became somewhat vital. You're going to see this as a theme throughout this class. One other area that Kurt Lewin was also influential in getting birth, in fact he coined the very term action research, was this idea of engaging in action research and survey feedback. Once again, you'll see very modern day examples of this in the field of education. Lots of educational evaluators utilize the concept of action research. In some cases, many teachers are trained how to do action research in their classrooms as a way of getting some sense of how well their students are learning. Action research is the process of bringing social research practices to people and groups to develop theoretical and practical knowledge and contribute to change. Really, the only difference between action research and laboratory research is the fact that the results of that research are fed back in preliminary ways in order to make changes while the project's still ongoing. Usually in typical laboratory research, we usually wait till the end of the intervention to assess the effectiveness of the intervention. In action research, you engage oftentimes in what's called formative feedback for the sole purpose of being able to provide preliminary feedback so that you can actually change and improve the project while it's still ongoing. So that's really kind of the difference between action research and modern day laboratory or other forms of research. This concept began back in the 1940s, early 50s. It began with some survey research that was being done at Detroit Edison. Essentially, they administered a survey at 3 different time periods. And by the time they got to that third time period, what they discovered is that those groups that actually began to take action on the results that had been presented at one of the earlier 2 time periods were more likely to report more positive changes in the nature of their work supervisors, the work environment. So once again, this idea of surveying, whether they be attitudes and opinions, and then feeding this back to employers who then took action upon them and made adjustments, was kind of a novel thing back then. We sort of take it for granted now, but a very novel thing, and so therefore this led to this idea of survey feedback. Once again, very much used all over the board today. Another movement was the idea of management practices. You probably are already familiar with some of the main models. I'm just going to go ahead and list them all here because I'm going to talk about them as a whole. And this is somewhat parallel to some of the findings that were happening in the study of leadership behavior. Leadership had moved from simply looking at the idea that leadership traits, which was sort of founded out of this philosophy that leaders are born, to the idea of leadership behaviors, which was really more a reflection of the philosophy that leaders are in fact made. And so under this leadership behavior, independent researchers led to the idea that there's 2 basic leadership behaviors. There's leadership behaviors that you engage in that go toward the enhancement and enrichment of people, and then there are leadership behaviors that you engage in that reflect a focus more on the task. This led very early on to the idea that some people have styles that are more people-focused and some people have leadership styles that are more task-focused. Well, even beyond the leadership area, as people begin to focus on not just the behavior of leaders, but the behaviors of all the processes, this kind of filtered down through even the way that people are managed. And so a number of these models that are set before you are really reflections of this basic philosophy that people are either task-focused or people-focused. So, for example, McGregor's theory X, theory Y, clearly reflects this. The idea of theory X, which, once again, if you're not already familiar with this, you read about in the chapter, is really more this idea that people are fairly lazy, and therefore they have to be kicked into the seat of the pants to get them to sort of move. And that theory Y is that no, people are very motivated. All they need is for someone to act as an enabler. Well, this very much reflects a sort of task focus versus people focus. If you assume the philosophy of theory X, then you're going to focus more of your attention on getting the task. So someone with a theory X philosophy of people is going to be more of a task focused kind of person, whereas someone with a theory Y is definitely going to be more people-focused. And if you look at Likkert's 4 systems of work, once again, each of these, as you'll see in your reading, clearly reflect this task versus people. Same thing with Blake and Morton. All they did was sort of consider the idea that you really can focus on both. And so if you put both of these together as though they were separate dimensions, you would end up with sort of a quadrant of 4 options. One being relatively more X with no Y, the other one being Y with no X, one being virtually none of these, and the other being both of these. And so that's essentially how they get their model. But if you look at the concern for production and the concern for people, clearly you can see once again the task focus versus the people focus. Herzberg's theory was really primarily looking at the idea that the things that oftentimes motivate us are not the same thing as the things that oftentimes keep us satisfied. So it kind of distinguished between the idea of satisfaction versus dissatisfaction in that case there. So it is a little bit different from the people versus task focus, but not too different in that case. Okay. So once again, each of these models reflecting this people versus task focus upon management practices sort of represented yet another movement that influenced the field of organizational development. One very big focus is this focus on quality and employee involvement. This is somewhat a direct result of the work that was done with T groups in the very beginning, in which T groups clearly demonstrated the idea that once you give people the opportunity to sit at the table, they'll very much get involved and want to process the information. Much of this work really flowed out of some of the changes that were taking place in Japan right after World War II. Edward Deming, who's known for the concept of total quality management, found the Japanese to be more sensitive to his principles. And so in that sense, the Japanese were really the first to implement much of Deming's ideas on total quality management. Well, a big part of total quality management means getting employees to be involved with focusing on quality assessments and then suggesting ways to increase quality improvement. Well, as the total quality movement began to be implemented in the States and other places, this concept of getting employees involved was also implemented along with it. And so hence the idea of employee involvement was birthed. So this led to the idea of quality circles, eventually total quality management, and probably today, some of you might be already familiar with the concept of Six Sigma, which is simply a more modern outgrowth of the total quality management movement. Okay. Moving on to organizational culture. The attention to culture is definitely something that is very much a part of organizational development. In many ways, culture is oftentimes attended to by companies. In many ways, people feel that it's too soft or too lucid a problem, but I can tell you of many times in which a number of problems in which I personally uncovered in organizations are all directly related to their fundamental failure to give culture its due. Right? Perhaps I'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about that in some of the latter presentations. But we can begin by defining culture as the shared attitudes, values, beliefs, and customs of members of a social unit or organization. This definition of culture sort of fits, national definitions of culture, for example. Some would sort of debate it. For example, the idea that culture has to be shared can be a somewhat debatable concept. There are definitely schools of thought that would suggest that culture isn't necessarily shared. For example, conflict can just as much reflect an organizational culture as the idea of looking at things that people have in culture. In fact, some have even suggested that it is the degree of sharedness or conflict or degree to which people even are aware of their culture that most adequately reflects culture. But what you have in front of you is, in fact, the most popular definition that is out there. One of the things that we saw is that organizational culture sort of exploded right around the 1980s, and in this sense it sort of reflected the national culture at large. That's about when culture was paid attention to in many other academic disciplines. So organizations began to look for ways in which they could leverage the idea of having a right culture and then look and see how that might lead to greater productivity and profits. As far as OD, many consultants began to undertake the idea of cultural audits and begin to evaluate themselves against competitors. Here the focus was really on creating what's called a strong culture. In the sense, strong might very much reflect the degree to which a culture is shared or known or salient by the people that are part of it. Nowadays, when we go in to sort of assess or conduct a cultural audit. Some of the things that you might look for in that would be language. For example, what are some of the sloganist terms that are used there? Metaphors that are used for success or leadership. Jargon that might be unique to a given organization. Communication patterns. Who talks to who and when? Media. To what degree is it used or not used? Artifacts. Just various things that might be unique to the organization that might stand out. That might be the way that the plant is organized or designed. It might be icons, the kind of stories that are told. Perhaps even the myths that sort of arose, or legends in that case. What kind of ceremonies and rituals are created in that case there. Lots of organizations have their own sort of ceremonies. The kind of things that they celebrate would tell you a lot about what's valued there. The value statements that are made. Ethics. Is there a code of ethics, and what are those ethics? Decision-making styles. How are decisions made in a given organization? Are they relatively more centralized, or are they relatively more democratic, right? Or any other kind of things that you might look at. In an organization, just about anything in an organization could in fact represent an aspect of its culture and therefore be something that one could look at when conducting a cultural audit. Change and reengineering. Probably near toward the end of the 1980s, you began to see this concept of reengineering sort of pop up. Oftentimes it was unfortunately associated with downsizing, and so in that sense it tends to have a negative connotation to this day. Ask anybody that was employed in organizations roughly around the late 80s, early 90s, and get their sense of what the term reengineering means to them. It oftentimes is synonymous with downsizing. Unfortunately, it doesn't have to be, but that tends to be what it is. Within OD, one of the things that happened is that it helped OD to become much more strategic in the way that we bring about change, in the sense that we had to begin to think about organization-wide kinds of concerns. The idea that small changes could in fact be connected to very large implications, or in fact lead to ultimately very large organization-wide changes. One of the things that OD consultants or practitioners were able to do is to begin to help executives with the idea of vision, mission statements, values. All of these were sort of a part of sort of more strategic planning kind of implementations that took place. Also able to help organizational leaders realize that the right strategy is meaningless unless it is communicated, understood, and adopted by organizational members. So in that sense, it really helped organizational leaders to understand that strategy without taking consideration of your people is not going to be very effective for you. And this led to an explosion of lots of academic research within the change management process. The idea of being resistant to change blossomed around the same time as well. Then organizational learning, which is sort of the most recent concept, definitely began to take root in the 1990s with Peter Senge's publication of the book, The Fifth Discipline. If I would recommend any book to anyone, regardless of what your background is, I would highly recommend Senge's book, mainly because I personally think it applies to more than just organizations in that case there. So definitely if you're looking for a book to add to your personal reading list, I would highly recommend that you read this book. I was assigned to read this book as a graduate student back in my early days of graduate school. But one of the things that Senge's book introduced was the concept of systems thinking. And I'll get a chance to talk about systems thinking in one of my upcoming mini-T lectures, so I won't sort of cover it now. I will tell you, and of course perhaps I'm spoiling the surprise, but this is in fact the fifth discipline. So Senge's book talks about a number of disciplines, and of course the fifth one is in fact systems thinking, which once again is learning to think about the idea of interdependencies and the wholeness of something. Personal mastery, which is one of the other disciplines, has a lot to do with the idea of beginning to see one's work as not just a job, but as a calling. And so really beginning to invest quite a bit into what you do and caring about how you do something. Mental models, the assumptions that we have about how work operates, but of course mental models aren't just limited to work. They would be models of that you have about how anything works, how life works, for example. Shared vision, the idea of getting everyone on board and having people truly understand the vision of the organization. If people are going to truly be able to make a valued contribution, they have to understand where the organization as a whole is going. Team learning, the importance of teams and groups in the organization, and therefore the importance of learning as a team became very important. And then this concept of single loop versus double loop learning. Now this actually isn't Singe's concept. Was actually developed quite some time before Singe came along, but the idea of not just focusing on single events, but learning how to look beyond single events and looking at patterns, and then looking at the issues that facilitate or hinder those patterns became a part of this idea of single loop versus double loop learning. And then finally, the idea of organizational effectiveness and employee engagement. In many ways, organizational development really began much out of the humanistic developments that were growing within workplace attitudes and psychology in general, actually. And so much of its focus was somewhat primarily on people and enhancing the lives of people. But it soon began to realize that if you were going to truly be able to help people, you've got to be able to convince the people who are in charge of those people that these strategies and that organizational development as a whole would be something that would be good for them to do. In that sense, you had to begin to focus on the business results. Would organizational development have implications beyond just improving people? Could it, in fact, have bottom line results? And a lot of the research seems to suggest that the answer could be yes. And so in many ways, the term organizational effectiveness has actually begun to replace organizational development as a preferred term, mainly because people sort of felt that organizational development was much more of a soft skills and did not have enough bottom line focus to it. And so the idea of organizational effectiveness seemed to have much more of this bottom line perspective. The idea of engagement, perhaps some of you are already familiar with this concept. It's sort of the more recent buzz term that's taking place in a lot of consulting circles, and to some degree the research is beginning to take hold in it. In some ways, engagement has replaced earlier terms such as motivation, morale, job satisfaction, or work satisfaction. Whether or not engagement is really anything different than those three things is, I think, yet to be shown. The models that are out there don't readily seem all that different from these concepts, but in many ways tends to reflect kind of the combination of them in that case there. So this employee engagement concept, which perhaps you'll notice is very much relevant or very much similar to the idea of employee involvement, has sort of become the latest buzz term. So these particular movements are all a part of the history of organizational development. As we talk in some of the next lectures about some of the core values and sort of core components of organizational development, perhaps you'll see how all of the things that we just talked about as a part of the history are a part of these core values. Okay? So that will end our lecture on history. Until next time, take care.